We are almost at the year 2020. Coverkillernation has been a thing for 10 years at the very least. There's at least been 10 albums of the year. Well, technically 11, but who's counting? As a part of looking back, as a part of peering into the decade that was, I think an important thing for us to remember are those 11 albums of the year. And whenever considering top lists, what's the album of the decade, things of that variety, we have to look at this a bit of a different way than perhaps the conventional thought would be. Let's look at these 11 albums of the year and let's rank them only among themselves. We'll have a second video that's going to come tomorrow where we look at 25 of the best albums of the decade. So however you really want to parse this is really up to you. But let's look specifically at the 11 albums of the year and rank them from 11 to 1 to see which album of the year would be the album of the decade. And we're going to start with numbers 11 and 10, which is Obscura's Omnivium and Moonsorrow's Wildrun Kurjem Choryodin Masa. I like to call the Moonsorrow album the album with Huto on it, because that's the reason why this got propelled to album of the year. I can remember how many days and nights that I spent listening to that track in particular whenever driving in my car. It became the official anthem for me for driving for whatever reason. It's a long track. And Moonsorrow is just a tremendously capable band that showcases a very nice connection between atmospheric black metal without really feeling like they are too deep into that genre. It has more melody to it. It has a little bit more excitement to it. There's a lot more heathenistic properties to it. It's a great album. And it compared with Obscura's Omnivium that very same year, considering this album's surprise. It was something that we understood that Obscura had great talent and great skill, but Omnivium seemed to put this all on display and place all of heavy metal, including its fans and bands, on notice, stating that they were going to be around for a long period of time and a group that was going to be almost impossible to ignore. Their technical death metal sound was something that just felt sterling and fresh, even though we had a lot of bands that were already trending in this direction and finding success with it. This one just simply was a bold declaration and one that served them for years to come. Number 9 is Orphanland with Unsung Prophets and Dead Messiahs. What a terrific album this is. This was an emotional pick for Album of the Year just last year in 2018. And as a result, it's one that in retrospect, if I remove that subjective idea of my own emotion, may have gone a different way. But for now, we're going with the ones who actually got the victory. And Orphanland's album is one that's extremely capable. It's one that is very deserving of this title, considering it's able to take on ideas such as the allegory of the cave and explore religion even more deeply in order to craft an album that feels loosely conceptual while having a very bold and very large concept all its own. The music itself is tremendous. It's really unfair to call them Oriental metal considering they're from the Middle East, but if that's the term that is being granted to them, they are the best the genre has to offer. And they are a group that has constantly reinvented themselves and have faced persecution for their own beliefs in their home country. Their story is fantastic, and so is this album, but it's only at number 9. Number 8 is Enslaved with Axima Ethica Odine. This is all the way back in 2010, the very first album of the year that we crowned, and definitely one of Enslaved's best. We have talked in the past that Enslaved may have albums that have superseded this one, but this was the one that grabbed the Album of the Year honors. It could sound confusing, but it's simply because the level of competition has certainly grown throughout Coverkillernation's existence. But this album, though, showed that this band was not going to simply rest on the laurels of the successes that they experienced and the changeover that they had in the 2000s. They were instead going to expand upon it even further and were going to take the ideas one step further, and this was the bold, heralding, declarative cry of exactly that. Such a tremendous release by a band that has now been going on for 3 decades and is entering into their 4th decade, perhaps with their strongest release with E, but also has an Album of the Year victory under their belt with Axima Ethica Odine. Number 7 is Vector with Terminal Redux. And this one is one that comes with a bit of an asterisk, I guess, by it. At least it would probably be termed as an asterisk by some members of the heavy metal community because of what we recently learned this past year with David DeSantos, and why this band probably will not be releasing anything anytime soon, and if they do, there will definitely be a markedly different market for them. I've always said that music is neutral, and this is an album that certainly showcases why that's sort of a fact, because this is crazy. This is all over the place. This is thrash metal that has almost the technical brutality of a technical metal album. There is screams abound. This is wild. Vector is unlike any product that you are going to hear in the heavy metal quasi-mainstream, and it's a real shame that some of the things have come out, considering this disc is bold. It has a lot to offer. Now, some might say that some of the prior releases by Vector may supersede this one, but this is the one that really impressed and laid its impression on me in such a huge way whenever it dropped that it immediately was a contender for Album of the Year, which it eventually did capture. Again, if you think that this is low on this list based off of the things that happened in 2019, there's a partial truth to that, but it wasn't something that really mired an objective opinion all that much. Number 6 is Elder with Reflections of a Forgotten World. This may be one that many would feel should be near the bottom, but I love this album so much, and especially the way that it starts off and just kind of bends the haze all the way through its finale. It was an album that I spun a lot during its release year back in 2017, and one that still to this day can be seen frontlining streams, either that or one that I can still just go back to so very easily and naturally assimilate myself into its glory. I love this album so very much, and Elder was another one of those bands that was somewhat surprising. I had been recommended lore by a fan prior to the release of Reflections of a Forgotten World, but it was also something that caused me to remember this band's name and scope this album out, and I am immediately, I gotta tell you how happy I was that I did, considering it immediately set me on fire. It became an instantaneous contender, and nothing was able to defeat it. Number 5 is Carcass with Surgical Steel. I want you to consider a couple of things all the way back in 2013. We hadn't heard a new Carcass album in nearly 20 years. And so the comeback album was a big thing that was happening in both the 2000s and 2010s. So you hear that they're going to have a comeback album and you think, okay, that could be pretty cool. You didn't expect it to blow your mind. You didn't expect it to be the best album that they perhaps ever made. That's what Surgical Steel is. They really were able to hone in on all of the best aspects of their latter era, their more melodic death metal era. They didn't channel that grindcore all of that much, but did have a couple of short songs that were really able to exemplify that, and the combined effort makes for a very smooth listen that also destroys you. It's just absolutely steamroller quality material. It's fantastic. This is still a disc that I think is going to make their upcoming 2020 secondary effort on their comeback trail extremely pressure-filled, considering they're going to have to go up against a stalwart they released 7 years prior that may be untouchable. Number 4 is Wildrun with Veil of Imagination, our brand new and final album of the year in 2019, is this high on the list. And why was it able to do this? It's because this band, who was already extremely talented, were able to dial up 11 on this album. They were able to take every single one of their tendencies and just amplify it to the point where it became its own legend, where it became its own science. They take all the tendencies that you hear from complementary bands such as Opeth and they make it their own. They have more of a heathenistic or more of a natural property to it. It's something that's absolutely difficult to explain. They have a tone and timbre that's all their own, and they faced heavy competition in 2019. This was one that came down absolutely to the wire, as was described in the Album of the Year video that you just watched, hopefully. This is an album that is here to stay. And Wildrun, already in the minds and the ears of many listeners, were a band to watch and a band to hear, because the evolution was going to be amazing. That evolution has come full circle, and those folks that were there from the start are looking like geniuses. I am thoroughly excited for whatever Wildrun is able to produce in the future. I am thoroughly a fan of what this band was able to do with Veil of Imagination, and I'm thoroughly thankful that here in 2019 we have a newcomer to the list take the crown, and also make it this high on a decade-end list. That's impressive. Number 3 is Steven Wilson with Hand Cannot Erase. I can't understate enough that every single year the competition seems to be really heavy and fierce. This was an album that had to beat out a heavy metal legend in Iron Maiden in order to capture this crown. And doing so with an album such as The Book of Souls that I consider to be one of their best, despite the fact that there's much contention to the otherwise. But Hand Cannot Erase It somehow to me supersedes The Raven That Refused to Sing and Other Stories, Grace for Drowning, and really everything else in his discography. And I think it's because the concept is one of unbridled depression and honesty. It's something that showcases just how mood can make music go from being just there to being exemplary. And that's exactly what Steven was able to accomplish with this album. He was able to take mood and take you on a journey that you were not going to be able to, simply forget about whenever the last tones of that song concluded. And as a result, it was able to overcome the powerful, powerful Book of Souls by Iron Maiden in order to become the album of its year of 2015, and one that still to this day haunts me as I listen to it constantly. Number 2, Creator with Phantom Antichrist. Going all the way back to, I believe it was 2012, we have an album that just absolutely bended the scorebook. One that got the first ever 100 out of 100, back whenever that was the way the scoring was handled. An absolute mind bend of thrash metal that just took you on a journey that never allowed you a moment to breathe. This is exactly what the term thrashterpiece is meant to mean, and it's one that was able to execute wonderfully. Amazingly enough, Gods of Violence, which Creator released a couple of years after this, is no slouch either. Still another fantastic album, one that was able to really capture the spirit of Phantom Antichrist and make it even more evil as fuck. But amazingly, because of the competition, it didn't get the album of the year. It was close, didn't get it though. Phantom Antichrist, to me, feels like a once-in-a-generation album for thrash metal. It's the one that, honestly, felt like it was looking at all of its contemporaries and said, okay, up your game, boys. And as a result, the remainder of the decade, we did have a lot of thrash that made presence on the list, whether they were elder groups or newer groups alike. Thrash metal is still alive and well, and there are still great bands that are producing tremendous thrash albums, and we've seen it throughout this decade because of groups such as Death Angel, because of Havoc, and more. That brings us to number 1, which is from 2014, and that's Neoblivious Scars with Citadel. The majesty of this album can't be understated enough. This is part of a scene that has really taken over metal over the course of the past half decade or so that is not talked about all that much, mainly because it's a bit unexplainable. This progressive death metal side that has a little bit more explorative nature, that loves longer tracks, that feels very theatrical, that feels very much like it is trying to give you a movie right within your music. Now, this isn't cinematic, but it's instead something where the movie or the thoughts are in your head, and the music itself has been absolutely impressive. The rise of Neoblivious Scars alone was remarkable, considering whenever I first saw anything on Portal of Eye, I looked at the name and said, what the hell does that mean? That is a name. Holy shit, that's a name. I have to check that out because of that name. That's why I did. It's the honest to God truth. That's why I checked out the band. And Portal of Eye was a tremendous album. It was a great effort. But then whenever I first heard Citadel, it blew me away. It knocked me on my rump and did not let go. I was gripped. Just recently on CKN Streams, we listened to this discography in its entirety. And Citadel, once again, was a marked achievement. It was the one that immediately had the impressionable attention of everybody listening and watching, where nobody wanted to depart. Everybody wanted to push the levels of their own sleep deprivation just so they could hear Citadel in its entirety. That is the importance that this album has had, not only for this band, but also for heavy metal in the decade of the 2010s. And it is the number 1 that I would select as the number 1 of the decade. What would be your number 1 of the decade? Let me know in the comments below, and what do you think about this list? Do the same. It has been a crazy decade. It's been a crazy career, and it's very rapidly coming to a conclusion. But I do hope that you'll join me next time, where we talk about 25 more albums from the decade of the 2010s, and where they rank amongst themselves and amongst heavy metal legend for this decade. I'm CoverkillerNation. Take care.